We are recording. We are back for episode 8 of Advanced Performance Radio with Matt from the Physique Collective, coming across from all the way in the UK. I'll give Matt the floor to introduce himself, tell us who he is, what he does.
Well, thank you very much for having me, mate. It's an absolute pleasure. I think the depressing part is talking about how bad the weather is in the UK compared to what you guys are dealing with. So a little bit jealous to start with, but thank you very much for having me on. So my name is Matt Strong. I'm one half of Physique Collective with my business partner, Joe. I'm an online coach. I coach mainly coaches or people who are kind of fairly advanced in that realm, and they want someone just to take the load off in terms of program design and all that sort of stuff. So they haven't got to overthink it themselves, which we're all prone to, especially coaches. We've got that little drop of autism that comes in to make you a good coach, and unfortunately it makes you terrible at coaching yourself. And then obviously got Physique Collective as well, where I tend to do the health management side of the equation, where Joe looks at the performance enhancing side of the equation. So that's a bit about me. I've also got another little business, which I'm terrible at pushing, which is Acne Antidote, which is essentially helping bodybuilders and anyone taking performance enhancing drugs to manage acne, which is one thing we see quite commonly within that. So that's a little bit basic about me. Been coaching for nearly 20 years at this point. And I hate to sound cliche and a bit of a prick, but I love what I do, and I'm very lucky to be doing what I do. So #blessed.
Yeah. How did the Physique Collective come about? Like, how did you and Joe, obviously, I follow Joe, obviously started following Joe thanks to Dean. And obviously you guys put out a lot of good content and stuff like that. But how did the Physique Collective come about? Like, how did it start?
So I had Joe as my coach years and years ago. Because again, similar to what I just said then, shit at coaching myself. And I was like, this guy seems really clued up, great guy. So I started working with Joe, and we kind of hit it off pretty much off the get-go. And there was 2 of our friends who were also Joe had coached, or we'd be in the same area. So it was Joe, myself, Christian Chapman, and Gareth Buchan. And we just kind of had a chat. We thought there's a bit of a gap, certainly within the UK market, for evidence-based information, which is actually what I would consider real evidence-based, as in we're taking the literature, we're taking anecdote, we're taking real-world experience, meshing it all together and providing some data on that. And we just decided about 4 years, I think it's 4 years ago in January, we're like, right, we're going to put this to market. And over time, just because Christian was doing his own thing, he's got his own coaching business, very successful there. Gareth left to do his own accountancy firm, doing really well there. It just ended up being Joe and I, which actually has been pretty good, because we're the guys who I would consider more kind of educators, quote unquote. And it's allowed us to streamline that to really push into the mainly like performance enhancing drug side of things and the health ramifications of that. We do also talk a lot about nutrition, training, and things that kind of fall into that remit. But yeah, it's about 4 years now, man. It's pretty crazy to see the growth, and we've always tried to do things in a really kind of ethical and honest manner. Like, I know you've got a bunch of questions today. If I don't know the answer, I'll say I don't know. I'm not going to try and baffle anyone with bullshit.
Yeah, I think it's obviously hearing that you guys have only been doing it for like 4 years. It's a bit, I guess, baffling in the sense of like I would have picked much longer, given like how much traction you guys have gained from what you're doing. But I think it's, especially in the space that you guys do a lot of education on, like obviously on the whole PD things, I think obviously people are seeking out sources of information. Obviously, like another person that does information on is obviously John Jewett and his stuff. But yeah, there's not many people giving out sort of, I guess, decent quality information on the PD side of things. And I think I'm sure with the UK, it's probably been the same. There's been a huge influx of PD usage in the last, say, probably 5 to 10 years. Like it's gone from being like you'd see maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 guys at the gym who like you didn't need to ask if they're on gear, like you knew because they were like fucking 120 kilos and absolutely massive, to like every gym rat, beginner, whatever, taking PDs, and it's almost become, I guess, a flex for some people that they're taking PDs, and like I guess normalizing excessive use. And it's pretty scary. Like, and I'm sure you've had plenty of people come through your office that have on just ridiculous amounts. How do you think we combat against this? Or try and attempt to help this shift in the industry? Like,
it's a hard one, man, because like you say, everyone's doing it. I'm 37, so when I grew up, no one would ever talk about gear. Like it'd almost be like a little nudge and a wink to the other big guy in the gym, but like, I know. But now it's almost like like you say, it's a flex. People are saying, I take this, and almost really proud of the fact of how much they're taking. And it's guys that don't even look like they train. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. People are jumping into that way too soon. It's almost like before we've got to earn the right, so to speak, quote unquote. Now people are jumping in. So I think the way you deal with it is honestly accept that it's going to happen. I think you've got the TikTok generation, you've got all these influencers who are gaining traction by talking about how much drugs they use, and obviously people are going to copy them. Right? People are going to say that guy's in amazing shape. This is what we need to do to get in shape ourselves, and unfortunately, that's just the way. So I don't think you necessarily try and fight that, argue that, treat people like they're stupid. I look at it the same way how you combat recreational drugs. So the main thing is informed consent. Do you know what you're doing? So instead of saying to these people, you're fucking stupid for doing this thing, or you shouldn't do it, that's going to work as well as recreational drugs. That didn't work. People were like, yeah, fuck you, I'm just going to do it and not tell you. So what we do instead is we try and talk to people about, okay, these are the drugs, these are the risks, these are the upsides, these are how you manage the risks, this is how you sort of get the best out of it, how you do it as safe as possible, not safe, as safe as possible, and let people make their own decisions. Because that way, you know what it's like. If someone told you, don't do that, you're a fucking idiot, you're like, well, I'm not going to tell you that I'm doing it. Whereas if we inform people how to do it as safely as they can, we're going to get more buy-in, and it's going to get people talking. And then maybe we can take someone who has had that initial, maybe very high drug use, maybe way too soon. When they start to understand the ramifications of that, how it maybe impact them later, they can maybe move down and take like more precautions, look at that in a more holistic manner. Because if we start that conversation, be like, you shouldn't do this, they're not going to listen. So I think it's having a bit of patience. And one thing Joe and I have always tried to do is we're not sensationalists. We're not going to sit there and argue with people on the internet. We're not going to flame people. We're not going to tell people they're stupid. We're just going to have a conversation. And that's probably set us apart, where we're actually willing to talk to people and understand them. And one thing I've always believed of is seek first to understand. If we understand why people are doing that, what's going on, maybe we can help them do it a little bit better.
Yeah, I think, well, it's like anything. You obviously, when you're working with a coach or when you are a coach, the idea is that there's an honest chain of communication between coach and client. And I think when the client comes in for an initial consult and you sort of like ridicule them for their choices, it automatically puts that barrier up of, I guess, ivory tower. I know all this and you've done this stupid shit and all the rest of it. And then I find it's very hard to change the person's, I guess, perspective, or to, I guess, come at things from a positive sense where you're working, I guess, collaboratively as a team, coach and client, to give that client better information. And like you say, if you tell that client or the person that they're an idiot, and then you try and obviously come at them with some solid information, they're not going to absorb it anywhere near as well. You were like, okay, like, all right, you've done that. So like, this is how we obviously could go about it and to be a much safer manner. Like, because I think there's a lot of coaches from I guess the old school generation who have got clients on these astronomical amounts of gear. And I mean, just crazy stuff. Like I've seen like hobbyists taking like 150 mega anadrol a day, like for like 6 to 12 weeks. And I'm like, and it's because they've approached someone, and like this, it doesn't just happen with PEDs, it happens with everything in the gym. They approach someone who's obviously a big jack dude or big jack chick or whatever the case is, and then gone, oh, this person's been doing it for a while, they know what they're doing. And I've had a lot of clients come from coaches like that, and I'm like, okay, did the person who recommended these things actually explain to you what they are, what you would use them for, the risk factor? They ask you to do a bit of your own research, so you do have that informed consent. Because you wouldn't go to a doctor and have them give you a script and they just give it to you. What's it for?
Just take it, bro.
But when it comes to a bro in the gym and he's stringing his singlet and his right wear shoes, someone will just go, yeah, no worries, I'll just jab whatever. But and that's just the general public. That's the fitness industry in general. It's putting people's trust in someone purely because of the way they look, and maybe if they compete or done well themselves. And sometimes it is hard to convince people to listen to a little bit of evidence when you've got some dickhead on Instagram saying like, oh, you just need like 500 mega trend. Like, so it is, I mean, we once came from, I guess, a time where people would only take PEDs to compete in an enhanced bodybuilding competition. Now you've got people taking gear for festivals, people taking gear for martial arts, people taking, gear just to all year round. Like people taking TRT when they're like 20. And I'm like, it doesn't quite correlate. Like I've seen so many young fellas. One of the worst situations I heard. I used to work in a commercial gym before I opened the place I have now, and in the toilet, sort of like washing my hands after. Then I hear these kids like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to bump my dosage up from like this to this," and I'm like, "Okay, cool, no worries." Sort of just ignoring it, and then when they go to leave, they put on their high school shirts and walk out the door. I'm like,
"What the fuck?"
and I went like to reception. I was like, "How old are those kids?" And like, "Oh, like 16." I'm like, "Fuck, man." Like they're talking about like trend and shit and like
Jesus.
But it's, the generation of TikTok, it's very little common sense and a lot of listening to the wrong people sort of thing. And it puts them in a position where they could make seriously large impacts on their health long term. I mean, a lot of these kids are going through puberty, but then taking steroids while going through it. And obviously, I am no endocrinologist, so I'm not going to talk about what the ramifications of that could be. I'm just going to hypothesize that, like, you could seriously damage your body's ability to produce testosterone naturally.
Yeah.
If you blocked out that pathway by taking testosterone throughout that period of puberty. I've seen like 16-year-old kids, 18-year-old kids who have done like 2 years worth of cycling, and it's like, fuck, man, like. Because of the normalization of it, it's just become so normal to take gear. And, you know what I mean? Same with like back in the day, if you saw a female that was taking gear, it's like, okay, cool. I'm not quite sure whether you're female or not. I'm going to make the assumption because you have long hair. But now it's like, 20-year-old bikini chick who wants to look better for a photo shoot or whatever, taking 20 mega Anavar a day. And I'm like, and we've just gotten to this point where it's normalized. And I guess, like you say, all we can do is give people the right information or as adequate information as possible, and hopefully they make informed decisions from there. But I've had clients drop me as a coach because I won't let them put their gear up.
I think it's always a difficult one, isn't it? Because it comes like business or ethics. But I always think if you operate with a good ethical and moral compass, you'll attract the right people. And ultimately, I look at all this. The people that are making these decisions, usually the young guys, they don't realize until it's a problem. So I've had a similar situation. We've had a bunch of bikini girls. I want to take this. I'm like, okay, why? And you just when you drill into it again, I'm not trying to disparage them. I'm not trying to make them feel like shit about it. But I'm like, okay, why is that? Do you understand the outcome? Like here, like here's some visual examples of people that have maybe andronized. And so virilized and got and developed some androgenicity. Is like, do you want to go through that? How important is having kids to you? And like, these are questions that you can ask. And certainly with guys down the line, it's like, okay, we all can't really imagine our mortality until we get older. When you're 20, when I was 20, I just think like I would have done fucking anything. And thank God I didn't have access to that stuff back then, because you don't really think. You're like, yeah, I'm invincible, and then you are until you're not in your head.
Yeah.
Then I see a lot of people now, and like myself, 37, see a lot of guys I coach around about my age now that they want to look great, they want to feel good, but they're concerned with longevity. But you weren't thinking like that when you're 20. But it's almost like you need someone to be like, look, these are the risks. Like, how do you feel about, I don't know, dying when you're 40, when you're 50, if you really don't take care of yourself? And it's a hard one, because when I was 20, if someone said I would die when you're 50, I can't even imagine being 50. So I'm like, yeah, fuck it. But now I'm like, fuck, that's not that long away. So I'm thinking, absolutely, do not want to die at that point. I've got more to live for. You've got more kind of context on the world. So I do point the finger a little bit at these TikTok influencers who really, unfortunately, don't really know what they're talking about. They're trying to do it for likes, views, and they're giving downstream problems to the audience.
Yeah. It's, as you say, like I in my 20s, I went through obviously the taking fucking probably a lot more than I should do. And it was because like I was, I'm quite an isolated person. I like spending a lot of time on my own, and went through just this like 2.5 years of just complete 100% investment in bodybuilding. Like had no intention of competing, but just everything was about going to the gym, getting bigger. And I mean, I think dosages may have got up somewhere around like the 1.5 grams total. And back then I was like, fuck, that's a lot. I know guys that are starting on that now.
Yeah.
Who are like 80 kilos ringing wet. And I'm like, fuck, man. Like they've got a 1,000 meg testosterone base before they add anything else in. I'm like, Jesus Christ. But it's, like I say, it's the scary thing. Yes, it's scary that like people are using it, but it's also scarier with the severity that they're using it. I did a powerlifting seminar years ago with one of like the guys that squatted like the heaviest in history, and the conversation of obviously PEDs came up, and he's like, oh, who in this room like uses sort of PEDs? You watch every single person's hands go up, male and female, and then he's like, who gets blood tests done? And you watch every single hands drop except mine and someone else. And I'm like,
fucking hell.
Fuck. So it's, people aren't, I mean, there's the cost of doing business, so to speak, with PEDs. And it's like, okay, if this is the route that you're going to go down, I'm never going to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. I'm just going to present you with the information, then you can make a decision from there. But if we do go down that route, this is the, I guess, the checklist of what I need from you to prove to me that you take your health seriously enough. I mean, like weekly blood pressure, regular bloods, getting a cardiogram done like once a year, obviously if dosages are fairly high, checking for like pre-existing medical conditions or like any sort of family history for heart conditions, stuff like that. And I start sort of rattling off these things to like potential clients, and like, oh fuck, that's a lot of money. I'm like, you just spent $1,000 on growth.
Yeah.
Like it's the disparity there between the investment. I'm like, you're whinging about money, but you're prepared to put yourself in a position where your health is like heavily impacted or could be heavily impacted without the necessary precautions of, I mean, like getting a blood pressure cuff, getting your bloods done regularly, having relevant checks and all that sort of stuff. And it's even more so when it comes to a prep sense, when you've got someone who's not only taking PEDs, but then he's obviously putting himself through the strains that come through with the prep. And then people get all antsy when you ask them to invest a bit of money in their health.
Yeah.
And I've had clients come in who literally come in driving like, I don't know, like a $200,000 Mercedes, and they start whinging about the cost of a blood pressure test, a blood pressure cuff. I'm like, I guess it's a huge red flag from the start. And like, I would probably discourage people like that working with me in the first place, because if that's your thought process, it's, everything is obviously an exterior thing, looking good, looking healthy, all that sort of stuff. I'm like, okay, that's probably who you are as a person. I'm not really going to change that. So I'm not going to sit here trying to fight you to get you to change that.
Yeah.
But luckily that's not super common in, I guess, people that I have consults with. But when you have a client, let's say you get to the point, do you have like a checklist of your own that you would want to see from the client before you would, I guess, even entertain the conversation of PDs?
I think it's obviously quite a nuanced one there, because sometimes in an ideal world, yes, and I'll kind of talk through this, how I'd like it to work. In an ideal world, you would get a bunch of tests, and I'll come on to that in a moment, beforehand. Sometimes it's the case, I need to get this client started and then I'll get buy-in.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll almost give them their head, like as in like I'll give them the ability to like we'll kind of do what you want a little bit, then we'll kind of over time I'll steer them around to my way. And you kind of know from the psychology who that is. Like I've had a client recently, he come to me, he's a relatively small guy taking more drugs than I've ever taken in my life. And I was like, right, there's obviously a problem here. Where are the problems? Where's the bottlenecks? And those bottlenecks come in nutrition, training, sleep, stress management, all those things. If I said to him, we're going to reduce your drug load down to start with, he wouldn't have started. So it's like, I'm going to fix this shit. Then I'm going to fix this other once I've got buy-in. But going back to the original question, things I like to look at is obviously a baseline set of bloods. And the things I tend to look for is with a full panel. Obviously, you get your red blood cells, you get your white blood cells, all that sort of stuff. Not the most relevant for a PD user. However, things like hematocrit, if the hematocrit is elevated before we've even touched anything, obviously we're going to run into thrombosis risk, which we don't want. Obviously, we look at things like your lipids. So typically, we look at in most blood panels HDL, LDL. What we can see is any pre-existing dyslipidemia, which is going to predispose us to atherosclerotic risk. If we've got the ability to get maybe ApoB, ApoA ratios, or just the actual values there, lipoprotein A, just have a real deep dive into someone's atherosclerosis risk, especially if they've got a family disease of family history of CVD risk. That's incredibly important because I think people massively underestimate the risk of atherosclerosis build-up in a very short space of time with high PED use, especially if your diet shit. We've also got things like I'll look at someone's thyroid, particularly, even though we may not be taking exogenous thyroid, but having that is great. Looking at someone's like, for example, let's say HSCRP, someone's existing test levels or hormone profile, whatever that looks like. But primarily, and then the liver and kidney values, see if there's any issues there. Maybe you've got an underlying issue. That's kind of from a blood work standpoint. But blood work only shows us like a snapshot in time. So people go, oh, my bloods were good. I'm like, okay, how long? So if you think about, let's say someone's come off a fucking aggressive cycle, they've had 6 weeks in the health phase, and they get their bloods done after 6 weeks. It's like, oh, my bloods are okay, I can go again. It's like, how long were they good for? Like, what was the time frame before that? Because we're literally seeing a snapshot. It could have been good for a day, like being a bit tongue in cheek there. But okay, my bloods were good for a day. Do I go again? It's like, well, how bad were they to start with? What's the time frame difference? So I'd also like to see other things like an echocardiogram for sure. And I think this is one of the things that I would probably say is most underrated. The reason for that is when we tend to see people die of sudden cardiac death from associated anabolic steroid use, there's usually some confounding variables. And that usually comes in the case of underlying issues. So maybe they've got a valve defect, maybe they've got some existing cardiac hypertrophy or myopathy. Is there something going on there that we maybe don't know? Because how would you know you've got a valve issue? How would you know you've got some like mitral or valve regurgitation or something like that? Is anything going on that we're not aware of? That's the stuff we don't know. And quite often I've had it before where someone's got an echo that they've got a valve defect. And you're like, how do you not pick that up? You might have just dropped dead one day. Especially when you look at a typical bodybuilder, high drug load, potentially not the best diet, stimmed off their fucking head on various. And then if you a lot of bodybuilders, especially the festival goers you mentioned, if you add recreational drugs into that mix, you've got a pretty bad situation. So I think getting that heart information to start with, but also gives you where to track from in future. And then depending on the age of the client, something like a CAC, so your cardio calcium score, seeing has there been any pre-existing atherosclerotic buildup, that's quite helpful as well. And then obviously things like blood pressure as an absolute negotiable. I also like to use potentially like fasting blood glucose, certainly if someone's taking a lot of exogenous insulin or growth hormone, something like that. Again, not the most accurate of tests, I will happily say that, but it's another marker. And I also think it gets people thinking. And then something which is a one that people tend to overlook as well, which sounds silly, is just someone's resting heart rate. If your resting heart rate's 90, that like, regardless of what you look like, how healthy you think you are, you're not in a good place. So there's a lot of things I would tend to look at from a get-go, but from a blood work perspective, those metrics and an echo, certainly if people are looking to push the envelope, so to speak, that's one I think people go, oh, it's expensive or whatnot. But having seen it happen, I've seen people die because they had an underlying valve issue they weren't aware of. I've seen people not put prophylactic measures in place and run into some severe cardiac myopathy. And those things potentially, especially if you run into things like fibrotic infiltration in the heart, that's non-reversible. So these things are very, very important to check.
Yeah. And I think it's a lot of people just aren't even aware of a lot of these things, because I'll speak purely from my perspective of in Australia. If you go to any doctor here and you even mention the S word, you just get looked at like you're a leper. And you mean trying to get clients to get relevant blood work done from their GP, and you just get all this pushback of, oh, why would you need that? You don't need that. You're healthy. Or they just don't want to. The clients aren't going in there like asking to be given steroids. They're just going in there to make sure they can manage their health and do things. Or they get like, I guess, belittled or spoken down to by the GP for obviously wanting to go down this path. And that's where I guess a lot of the external blood testing companies do come in handy. But I think there's just not enough people talking about the necessary health side of performance-enhancing drug use. Like I remember a guy who used to train at a gym I worked at, and looking across the gym, and is he fucking sunburnt or what? I'm like, and I go out and I went over like for a chat, like trying to do a bit of reconnaissance, and his head's like 4 shades darker than the rest of it. And I was like, man, you look like a really jacked match. and it was, I was like, man, just out of curiosity, what's your blood pressure like? Obviously, he's definitely like quite a bit of PDs.
Yeah.
He's like, I don't know, man. I was like, man, would you mind coming in my office and just so we can do a bit of blood pressure? It was like 180/100.
Yeah.
And I was like, fuck. And he's like, oh, is it a bit high? I'm like, a bit high. Like, you should be in hospital.
Yeah, bro.
Like, I'm honestly surprised that you haven't had some form of cardiac event.
You're completing blood pressure here, bro. You need to like sort this out.
Yeah, you've achieved the final boss of blood pressure. And a bit of talking to him, find out he's on like 3 grams of gear.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how long's that been? He's like, oh, a good 6 to 8 months. I'm like,
bruh.
Fuck. And I was like, what's your diet like? He's like, yeah, I'm eating like 3,500 calories. I'm like, dude, you weigh like 100 kilo. Like, I've got female clients that eat more than that. Like, you could probably take 2/3 of that gear usage away and just eat 4,500, 5,000, and you'd probably look better and be in a much
healthier spot.
But it's you know what I mean? I guess it's another form of drug addict in the sense that it's like, okay, well, if this does this for me, then I'm just going to push the envelope more. And before you know it, the envelope's turned into a fucking shipping crate because you just
it's so true, man. I think the thing as well, and there's quite a few things that go into it. And if you think about psychology wise, like more does more, right? It's a human condition. We all believe that more money is going to make me happy. More this is going to make me happy. More whatever. And with drugs, unfortunately, and the thing we have to be really honest about is they work, right? So if you can see a gram works, well, 2 grams got to work better, right? But it's like we're not looking at the whole system. And that's where, and look, I think the thing that often gets confused when we talk about, let's say, safer use, or we tend to call it just risk management. People go, I still want to get jacked though. Like, we're not saying that. And I always use the car example. So say you've got an F1 car. These things are designed to whip around the track as quick as possible. We're talking, we want to win championships. And that's what the cars are there for. So performance is the utmost priority. These guys still have roll bars. They still wear safety. They have a safety cage. They still wear helmets. So it's not that we're saying performance isn't the most important thing, but there has to be an element of safety that comes with that. Because if say you're whipping around that track in just like a shell, and these guys are just like sat there in shorts and t-shirt, we're like, well, that doesn't seem particularly safe. We're not trying to avoid performance. And I think that's where people go wrong is, I don't want to not get gains. We want you to get as many gains as possible. We can't get gains if you're dead. So we want to make sure that we're doing at least the most we can to get you to your goal, not only with the performance element in mind, but as healthy as you can be to do so. It's not like you've got to pick one. I don't want to be big, so I've got to be healthy. Like, no, you can be as healthy as possible while still getting towards your progress.
Yeah, I think it's obviously I like the car reference as well. And I tried to explain this to a client the other day. I'm like, dude, you can't sit on the red line forever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Cars take pit stops for a reason.
Mm.
You know what I mean? They have to downshift gears to go around corners. Like it's not just fifth gear pinned to the floor all the time.
Mm.
And I was like, I understand that you want to make as much progress from one prep to another, or I mean, getting as much size or whatever the case is. But there's got to be some give and take. And I've had clients over the years where they've obviously come on board, done their blood work, and they're obviously already on the cycle. And I see the bloods, I'm like, okay, man, so you're going to have to come like pretty much nearly completely off, because all of these blood work parameters are so far out of whack that if we don't get this under control, like something's going to go like it's going to be fairly bad. Like I've seen clients where their cardio risk factor score is like a 9, and their test is like through the roof. Their HDL and LDL are both completely fucked, and their resting heart rate, like you say, is like a 95 to 100. It's like, okay, so he's like, oh, like, are we doing this to like make me perform better? I'm like, no, I'm doing this so you don't die.
Yeah.
And it's some people are quite shocked when I guess I'm quite blunt in the sense of like if it's a health concern, I don't care if you want to be massive or not. Like my first port of call, my first concern is your overall health. And I've had to tell clients, and they're like, oh, I want to get really jacked for like this event. I'm like, okay, I want to make sure that you make it to that event.
Yeah.
Because if we don't sort of pull the handbrake up and get stuff under control, I said, look, it's not saying that you can't ever go back on cycle again or ever go down that route again, but there needs to be some almost like countermeasures put in place, or some I guess bit of handiwork with all the blood side of things and health parameters and stuff like that. And I see so many bodybuilders who decide to go down the PD route who just don't do any cardio for a start. They just aren't. And they're like, oh, but I'm not trying to get fit. I'm like, but you should also try not to die. And obviously, especially when you've got guys that are starting to get up towards like the 115, 120, 130 kilo mark, man, they're like, oh, it's good. I'm a big guy. I'm like, you are aware that your heart, lungs, and all your like organs that keep you moving aren't scaled up just because you're bigger. I'm like, the bigger you get, you're essentially getting a Hummer and putting an Isuzu motor in it. Like it's or like a tiny little 4-cylinder. The bigger you get, the more strain that you are going to put on your system as a whole. I mean, it's for example, like when obviously the sad occurrence of when Dallas McCarver passed away, and the autopsy results were like lungs weighed twice what they normally should, heart was like 1.8 times, golf ball size lump on the thyroid, and it's like that's what I guess abuse of steroids can do.
Yes,
and
it's a scary game, mate. And I'll tell you what, as sad as that is, it does create a bit more awareness, because I think you see these guys and they're like, I need to push it, and then you say, well, these are the examples of when it's gone wrong, but let's also look at some other people. So you look at someone like Sebum, and you think, right, so he's maybe putting on, like, I think his biggest ever change between competitions in the Olympia was like 8 pounds in a year.
Yeah.
And you got these guys going, I need to put on 50 pounds. You're like, right, you got the arguably the best bodybuilder that maybe ever lived, certainly within classic. And people are like absolutely blown off their seats that this guy's put on 8 pounds. So, and he's doing that, and he's not sacrificing his health to do that. He's focusing on the cardio, focusing on eating well, focusing on, he doesn't take the piss with drugs. Like that's a really good example of like, look, this is what you should be doing. And I think having people like that, certainly, I say in the sport, I know he's kind of obviously retired now, but having that there, that does help when you see you've got clients who are, I need to push it. I'm like, well, look at this guy.
Yeah.
Right. Look at the people that didn't do that and were stupid. They're in the ground now. Then look at the people who have been relatively sensible, done everything right. That's the kind of route we want to maybe focus on, because we don't want any more deaths in this community. Like it's an awful thing to happen. I mean, there's literally nothing worse than someone dying from something they could have prevented, especially people that are far too young to go. And it's like, well, this is why I want to have that conversation without making people feel stupid. It's like, well, okay, these are the risks though. And the more conversations we have like this, it's like, okay, we're not saying don't do it. Like I take performance enhancing drugs. Most of my clients take it, but we have to also look at that with that viewpoint of like, how would you feel about dying tomorrow? And that's when you start to get people to think that, these are questions I ask, is like, okay, you're saying all these things, but okay, you've got a family. Do you want your kids to not have a dad? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay, well, so why are you taking these risks? And you get into make it a bit more visceral, that conversation, because I think because people don't think, we're all like that. I certainly don't think like about my mortality until someone questions me on it, and then you can start to go, oh fuck, okay, like I don't want that.
Yeah, and that was probably one of the biggest things for me, man. Like with like I've got 4 kids, and like fuck, man, like being Jack's great, but being around to see your kids have kids and grow up and all that sort of stuff is a lot better. And I think, I mean, I was at the Arnold Classic the year that Dallas died, the Australian Arnold Classic, when he collapsed on stage. And I remember being backstage, like outside and in the foyer sort of thing. And he was walking past with like Big Josh from Australia. And I remember thinking, I was like, fuck, man, that guy looks like he's going to die. And then like a couple of months later, he did. And I was like, fuck, man, like awful what? And it was a shockingly, I guess, brutal situation, because when he fainted on stage or when he went down, the only person on stage that stepped in to try and catch him was Guy Sistanino, who's like half his size. Like everyone else was just like, and moved out the way and just let the poor cunt hit the deck. And I think there's all these people trying to, I guess, abuse PDs to get a big following. I mean, win competitions, all this sort of shit. And at the end of the day, no one's going to write on your tombstone, was fucking jacked.
Yeah.
So I think there's such a big, I guess, need for the health, giving people the right information, like even with like female use of PEDs, the amount of females that are taking more than what gender reassignment dosage would be.
Yeah.
Or taking what they think is primobolan when realistically it's just test.
I mean, I've had that quite a lot with girls in Australia. Like they'll say, I've got this legit primo. And I was like, just get it tested. Oh, it's expensive. And I was like, yeah, it's worth testing, because if it's not, then even if you're taking 30 mg a week, that's going to fuck you up. And we got it tested. Guess what? Test prop. And that's happened more times than I care to admit. And I mean, I've got pretty strong views about female PED use anyway. And I think it personally, I don't think, like with guys in the health risk, I don't think people really realize the negatives. And I always think, what would I advise my sister to do?
Yeah.
And it would be never take it. Now, obviously, I can't speak to people's desire and want to compete in competition, but are you genuinely aware of the risks? And if you are, I could never tell anyone what to do. That's not my purpose in life. I'm never going to try and police other people. But I say, are you willing to accept these consequences? Because when they happen, they are reversible. And if you're happy with that, cool, more power to you. And I've got no problem with that. But I think it becomes too common. A lot of, like, say, young bikini girls and things like, oh, you've got to take this to compete. Right. But it's all well and good taking a drug and then rocking a pro card if that means something to you, or getting to the Olympia if that means something to you. If you're coming third at a regional and you sacrificed your femininity that you're going to be distraught about later, is that worth it? And I think no one's having that conversation, because a lot of coaches want that. I want to win on my roster.
Yeah,
that is, to me, horrendous. That you're willing to sacrifice someone else's life essentially for a gold medal. Like that's pretty dark.
You hear these horror stories where it's like where coaches are like, oh, if you want to win, this is what it takes.
Yeah.
And it's like, fuck, man, like
that's what you think it takes.
Especially with this younger generation. Like I've like I said in the past, I've had clients come to me who have gone with like some meathead fucking old school coach from before, and you look at their training program, it makes no fucking sense. You look at their diet, it makes no fucking sense. And they're on fuck tons of gear. And I'm like, okay, like just stuff that you would look at and go, okay, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why are you running Anadrol in the off season for like 8 weeks plus at a time? Like your androgenic load is already higher. And then you throw in something like that that's so, I guess, toxic.
Toxic, yeah.
Yeah, and I've tried it in the past, and I was like, "Fuck, man, I can't stand up properly."
GI issues, it's GI issues, bloating. Yeah, at the end of the day, you're messing with a methylated oral, which is going to offer a lot of problems to kidney. I mean, Anadrol is the only steroid that's potentially got links directly to cancer. So you're like, yeah, let's pick that one. Maybe put that one in the bin.
I remember reaching out to like obviously a person I was like getting help with at the time. And he's like, oh, yeah, man, we're going to bump it up to 100 milligram. I'm like, dude, I'm getting nosebleeds like every 5 or 6 hours.
Yeah.
Like, and it was, I've been very lucky in the sense, like, I obviously don't blast or anything anymore. Like, fucking just don't see the point in it. But never really had any bad sides. Never really had any, like, really, like, gyno or, like, I'm already obviously bald as fuck. But, like, I think that was just...
That was going to happen anyway, right?
That was going to happen anyway. So, and I'm just lucky because I got a fucking tattooed lid, so it just kind of helps. But I've seen other people who literally like a dropper in a bucket worth of gear but they're straight away huge sides. You know what I mean? Gyno, all sorts of stuff, acne, like ridiculous acne. And I've also seen females, like obviously not everyone responds to dosages the same way. Everyone's an individual. And this is one of the things that like I think is so funny when people prescribe anything. They're like, oh, this is a dose. I'm like, well, how do you know that's the dose unless you've seen blood work? Like, how do you I mean, that's like looking at a car's bonnet and going, oh, it needs a new alternator. How the fuck do you know that? You looked at the bonnet. Like it's, and I mean, I've seen so many instances of that where people were just prescribed something ridiculous. You know what I mean? Just like first time bikini competitors on like Anavar, Stanozol, Clen, T3, T4, and the physique they bring to the stage just doesn't reflect the punishment they've put their body through to get there. And I mean, I've had one client in particular who he won the heavyweight division in his bodybuilding show, top 3 in classic, and everyone's like, oh, he must have been running hit to shit. I'm like, he was running like 600 meg total. Like that's all I needed. Like it was, we didn't need to go any higher than that. So like, why would we? And it's, yes, people think more is better, but just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Absolutely.
I guess, let's say we're at a point now where someone, like you say, you've done the relevant health checks, all the rest of it. What sort of, I guess, advice would you give to someone on structure of introduction, safer compounds to obviously use? Because I think a lot of people vastly underestimate the severity of certain products. You know what I mean? Obviously, trend, never approved for human consumption. So where would you, I guess, I'm not going to say steer, what would you guide someone? Where would you say they should possibly start if they are going to go in that route and you had to give them some, I guess, evidence-based advice?
Yeah, so I think if we start off with, let's start off with compound selection first, because I think that's a good place to start. And I think this is where people can often get very excited. There's quite a lot of steroids available on the market, and essentially all derived from testosterone. And let's say we're looking at androgenic anabolic ratio for what that's worth. And essentially what we're trying to do is get these drugs to give you the anabolism, the muscle growth side of things, without the androgenicity, which is where we see the male characteristics. So like jawline, hair growth, voice deepening, essentially putting a male for puberty. So trying to like separate the two, and that's where all these drugs have kind of come in essentially, and we've created a bunch of different things. Now, in that journey, we have to understand that all these anabolics, they all grow muscle at the same rate. So what we say by that is, when we talk purely the androgen receptor, so these drugs are going to bind to the androgen receptor, So that could be testosterone, masteron, primo, nandrolone, tren, whatever it is. It's going to bind to the androgen receptor, and it's going to exert an effect downstream of that. It's going to cause some gene transcription. We're going to start to build more muscle, and that's going to be where we're going to get the most of our benefits from these drugs. Now, all these drugs have the same impact at the androgen receptor. So we could take testosterone, we could take tren, we could take anavar, take anadrol. They all do the same thing once it's bound there. So if we know that, and we say they're all going to grow at the same rate, speaking purely from the androgen receptor, which drugs would we use? We would use the ones that are probably the safest. Now, the one caveat I'll say to that is some drugs exert a different effect. For example, more DHT derivative types will have a higher binding affinity for the EGFR, endothelial growth factor receptor. And then you may get more force production. So you see like drugs like masteron or Superdrol being something that you'd use maybe as you notice a strength increase from that. So we'll put that to one side. And then you also notice things like, let's say, trenbolone, that's got a higher binding affinity for the glucocorticoid receptor. So it's going to turn off muscle protein breakdown. Okay, so it's going to get a bigger net benefit. But again, there's some side effects with that. But if we talk purely the androgen receptor, they all grow muscle at the same rate. If we accept that, we look at the vast heap of drugs that we've got and say, what is the safest options we've got available to us? And they would tick a couple boxes. So they're like, have we got human trials on that drug? Have we ever used it in what we say clinical deployments? Has it ever been prescribed for an issue, and therefore we've got human data? It's been safe and approved for human use. So let's take an example where we see some drugs, tren, equipoise. Equipoise not got any human data, right? Never been approved for human use. Tren, never been approved for human use. So these drugs, we have very limited human data, or if any human data. We know that it's going to grow muscle at the same rate. If we compare that to a drug, maybe like, obviously testosterone being your base example, where we got fucking tons of data and we know it's relatively safe, obviously it gets prescribed with TRT and such. We've got drugs like Primo, which we've got clinical trials for 1,200 milligram per week in females. We can say it's relatively safe, quote unquote. If you put those drugs on the table and you say, you've got this one drug, let's say equipoise, no human data, in animal data, looks like it causes oxidative stress, brain damage, kidney damage. And then you've got another drug like Primo, which got approved for human use and relatively benign. Which drug are you going to use? You're like, well, maybe the safer one. Now, I'm not saying the other drugs don't work, because they absolutely do work. But if someone's like, okay, you've got two boxes, one box, we've never tried it on humans, and it's going to potentially give you loads of side effects, and it'll work. Or the other box, you're like, this has been tried on humans, it does work, and it grows muscle at the same rate. Which one are you going to use? It's like, well, probably the one that works without any side effects, right? So that's the one we would instinctively lean towards. So my selection is like, am I using a drug which is as safe as it can be? Now, again, other people may have a different way of looking at that, but that's the way I would look at it and say, they're all going to grow muscle the same. I'll choose the one with the least side effects. So that gives us like a couple drugs really in the rotation. Testosterone as a base, as you'd always expect. Masteron, Primo, potential situational use of anavar, and realistically, like maybe nandrolone, but I've got my own issues with that. Trenbolone, if you're a contest prep bodybuilder, at very small dosages, even though it's not approved for human use, it's a very situational use.
That'd be more towards the tail end anyway, wouldn't it? So
and I don't tend to use it particularly with a lot of people anyway, for various reasons I can come on to. But that would pretty much sum up from an anabolic steroid standpoint what drugs we've got available to us. There's obviously a host of other drugs, right? But I would, if people are looking at other drugs, I would obviously, and I'd really encourage people to do is understand the rationale why someone would use that drug. I see people using DHB, why? Equipoise, why? Ment, anything else. I'm like, what the hell are you using these drugs for? What's your rationale? Because it's not going to grow muscle any quicker. It's only going to give you more side effects and other problems. So that's where I'd start. In terms of like dosages and things of that nature, I'm very reticent to say, oh, it has to be a certain dose to start with, or you have to earn the right to take something. I think it comes down to you as an individual, what your risk profile is. And that comes from an informed consent standpoint. It's very easy to say, oh, yeah, your first exposure should only be 200 milligrams or 250 milligrams. What if that person wants to win the Olympia and they've got the genetics to do so? Do you like hold them back from that and tell them they can't do something? I think as long as you go through that and you're on the same page with that client, I think that as long as they're understanding the risks, It's their call. And I'm not saying someone's first exposure, you go, 3 grams in the mix, bro, off we go. But I think there's an element where you have to, you can't just say this is what you're going to, like, this is the only dose you can take to start with. I think it's very gatekeepery. I don't really like that. In the same way, I don't really agree when people say, oh, you can only take drugs if you compete. You can do it whenever you want if you are informed. So dosages, you typically, in best case scenario, start low, 250 milligram per week, and see how you go with that. And that I wouldn't want to see someone's first exposure really go over a gram, but again, depends on their risk tolerance, whatever it may be. And I tend to escalate up as we need it. There's no point going in straight at a gram for someone's first exposure. It's like, maybe can we ramp up to that over maybe 6 months, perhaps? See what their biofeedback is, how they respond to that drug, side effects, etc. It gives us a chance to maybe come up and come down, and we're then ramping up, probably scaling to body weight as well, where it becomes a bit more appropriate. In terms of how I would go about a stack design, quite simply, without going into the minutiae, as much testosterone as you can tolerate, and testosterone is super important because you've got estrogen, which people tend to shit themselves about. But estrogen is incredibly important from a health perspective. So it's cardioprotective, neuroprotective. It's going to help with not accumulating fat. It's going to help with sexual function. So a bunch of things. So high estrogen, or estrogen in general, people tend to really be really worried about. It's only an issue if an issue presents itself. And that, obviously, someone will run into potential problems if they just go straight from test. But for someone like myself who can run into estrogenic issues at maybe 200 milligram, 150 milligram per week, so you can go to a gram without experiencing that. But you want testosterone because you need estrogen and you need DHT. Again, DHT, sometimes people think is a bad thing, but again, we need it for brain health, sexual function, lots of good stuff. So we need a testosterone base. And then we're essentially going to go for as much test as we can handle as an individual. That's going to depend on you. And then if we got to our maximum amount we want to use with that alone, fantastic. If not, and let's say you wanted to take a gram and you've taken 300 milligram test and start to run into issues, then you would start to add in a non-aromatizing compound to kind of fill the gap, so to speak. Primo, Masteron, whatever that looked like, where you had availability of on a personal preference level, and then went from there. But yeah, typically I would only use Primo, Mast, testosterone, Anavar situationally, Winstrol-based situationally, Tren very rarely in the right individual. I'm not a big fan of synthetic progestins in totality, so like Tren, Nandrolone, not a big fan of, just for neural function and some other concerns I have with them. So that would be like a general, very quick TLDR, too long didn't read, how we would start the design.
I think from what I've seen with a lot of people is that they make the assumption that the test they need to take to get the job done is a lot higher than what it actually is. Like, you'll see, I don't know, like an 80 kilo individual taking like 750 mega tests. I'm like, okay, it's probably a bit more than what you need. So, but then again, like you say, some people can tolerate.
Yeah.
But I think there's a fine line between what you can tolerate and what's smart. Just because you can tolerate it doesn't mean you technically should. So I think people tend to push the envelope. Like I've seen people who are taking PDs and they're like, oh, I've got my blood pressure under control. I'm like, that's because you take blood pressure medication. It's not because you've managed your blood pressure. Like you've managed it like pharmaceutically. And if we remove that right now, there'd be a pretty serious issue. So it's almost like that the episode of The Simpsons where like they're trying to figure out why Mr. Burns hasn't died yet. It's because all the germs are trying to go through
can't go through the door at once.
Yeah, so it's I think there's a lot of like bodybuilders who are like that. It's like, okay, you're only not getting really bad side effects because you like there's a bit of a balancing act going on here. And I think with dosage, a lot of people just, I mean, considering the two that are not seen in clinical trials for humans, not got a lot of human data, like you said, equipoise and Tren, the usage of it's ridiculous. Like I've had people say to me, like, well, they've said, oh, hey, this is what I was thinking about taking. I'd be like, I know, test and equipoise and other things. I'm like, why, what logic did you use to choose equipoise? Like, what was your reasoning for choosing that? And they're like, oh, it's just what I was told to take. I'm like, okay, that's not logic, but it's, and then when you present that, obviously that information to them, like, okay, so this is like never approved for human consumption. Like we've got no data on it, and as you say, there's a lot of negative side effects. And I've seen people take both Tren and equipoise to quite large dosages, and then wonder why they feel like absolute dog shit. So it's
EQ is a funny one, man, because the thing we have to say as well is just because there's no human data doesn't mean it doesn't, like, it might operate differently on humans than rodents and horses. And I'm always very quick to say this is like, I'm not anti any drug. Like I've had it before and people are like, oh, why are you so against equipoise? I'm like, I'm not at all. I generally don't have an opinion on it either way. But it's again, using that example before, is that if you've got these two drugs, one appears safer than the other, why would you use the other one? Now, that isn't to say that in humans it metabolizes differently than in rodents. It's not to say we can't offset those negatives with high dose antioxidants. Maybe we don't run into kidney issues. Maybe we don't run into brain issues that we see in these other models. But we're saying a lot of if, buts, and maybes at that point. It's like maybe it doesn't, maybe it doesn't. We don't know, and that's the concern. There is, I think we can very easily convince ourselves of something because we want to use a drug, and I'm absolutely not saying you shouldn't use it or it doesn't work, because it definitely does work. But is there something that would work just as well without any side effects? That would be my question. And
I think it's just a risk mitigation factor more so than it not being effective. Like, I mean, it's yes, you could work 7 days a week, but
do you want to?
Yeah, do you want to, and do you want to deal with the possible risk factors that come with working 7 days a week? So I think
that comes down to an open communication. This is the thing I want to try and give some nuance, because it's not me saying don't take this, because all of a sudden you back people into a corner that I'm going to fucking take it anyway. You know, I've never said that. Like, but again, if we just think about this logically, as all the points I just mentioned, if someone could give me a valid rationale, they're like, oh, I've tried all these drugs, I've got all the blood work, I feel better, I look better because of this drug. I'm like, I can't argue with you. But quite often people aren't going to that extent to get that data to then say it works or it doesn't. They're just saying that's what I'm going to take. And I think it's very easy to say you're going to take something and not think about the health ramifications of that.
Yeah. And I think it's obviously we can't disregard someone's personal experience and how their body's responded to something. Like, it's some people can achieve pretty amazing things that just isn't explained. Like, there's no real logical explanation as to why that's occurring. And it doesn't mean that it's not effective for them or it's not a viable option. I think it's just, if someone was to say, okay, like, what options? So, okay, well, these are shown to be safer. We have more data, there's more information, the risk factor's lower. With, obviously, with specifically PEDs in terms of like, and like with testosterone based and androgens and stuff like that. Where do you find like exogenous insulin use fits into all of that?
So I think with insulin, I'll probably go back a step. People tend to shit themselves with insulin. They're like, oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm like, most of the horror stories we hear, in fact, I would say all the horror stories we hear are in type 1 diabetics. So if you are a type 1 diabetic, then absolutely playing around with exogenous insulin could be very dangerous for you, because you have no homeostatic mechanism which you can fix this. However, if we were to look at something like an LD50, so LD50 is like the point at which 50% of the participants of a certain dosage would die. If we looked at the LD50 of insulin versus caffeine, the difference away from a working dose is actually further away from working dose with insulin than it is with caffeine. So what that means is you're more likely to die from taking like pre-workout or too much caffeine in a day based on the dose that works with caffeine than you would from insulin. So no one's shitting themselves about having caffeine in a day, but by comparison, you should be relative to insulin. So I think people massively get their ass in the hand. People go, oh, don't touch insulin. You're like taking 2 grams a week of gear, man. Like, that's the least of your problems. So I think insulin certainly has a place. I'm not saying everyone should take it, but there's a couple of things we would look at from insulin use and say, this could be really beneficial for you. So one, you've got the kind of blood glucose control. So let's say you're an individual who's got a lot of food in, a lot of carbohydrate, and you talk about redlining, you're essentially redlining your pancreas. You're pushing your body's insulin production to the limit, and that is not probably a good thing. Pushing your body's system to a red line is not a good place to be. So the introduction of a basal insulin like Lantus, which is almost like a 24-hour insulin, we're just going to essentially take the load off. So let's say on average you're producing, let's say 60 units of insulin per day from your pancreas, and that's redlining it. And we introduce 20 IUs of Lantus per day. What we're doing is the body now has to produce 40. So it's working less hard. And that is a nice place to be. You're not flatlining a system. In addition, you might have better nutrient partitioning, especially if you're using things like growth hormone, which may affect your insulin sensitivity. That's going to help, obviously, from a partitioning standpoint. Certainly, if we were to use a faster acting insulin around the workout window, where we can now use a higher amount of insulin-mediated glucose transport as on top of non-insulated mediated glucose transport, we're going to get from GLUT4 translocation and things like that. So essentially make our body's ability to take up glucose where we want it to at the muscle a lot better. And we've also got a synergistic effect. When we take anabolics plus growth hormone plus insulin, we're getting a 1 + 1 + 1 = 5 type thing, where we're getting an increased production of localized IGF-1. That's obviously going in synergy with the anabolics. We're going to get more muscle growth from that. So it's a partitioning standpoint. It's saving the body's system, shall we say. And it's also going to be a synergistic effect with taking anabolics and growth hormone that we're going to see downstream of that. So it does a lot of things. And also the other point, which I think people forget, is really people are very, very keen to hammer that lever when it comes to anabolics. I'm going to take more and more drugs, but we've got other things we can use, other kind of systems. That means we haven't got to like hammer that one system. So if, for example, we took a lower dose of anabolics and we combined that with some GH and some insulin, we might get the same growth outcomes from that, but with a lot less, let's say, toxicity, to use that word. We're not pushing one system particularly hard. And that would be where, if we're someone who wants to be a bit safer, that would be sensible rather than just pushing one system. And if we're someone who's trying to get maximum outcomes, we're just using another pathway to get a bit more out of it. So there's a couple of ways we can use it.
Would you say, in terms of, like, for instance, with female clients, would you say that could possibly be a more viable option with a female to avoid, obviously, that like androgen, like the test, like obviously the virilization that comes with it?
It's a difficult one because we haven't got the anabolics there. I don't think it's likely we're going to get the increased growth outcomes because we haven't got the anabolics to be able to utilize that IGF-1. We can use it.
I would say more so from a standpoint of, like, say, like obviously for a female client to drive calories, like you were saying, obviously glucose inside things. Like if you had a female client who got up towards like 600-700 grams of carbohydrates, in that scenario, would you say it'd be an effective method?
Yeah,
like to try and distribute the glucose a little bit better.
It can certainly be used, and I think when we look at females, I'm very much I don't like using anabolics unless it's like completely warranted. They're going to be very competitive, etc. So we have to kind of use these marginal performance enhancers, which are non-androgenic, insulin, growth hormone, telosartan, metformin, a lot of these things that very small benefit, but when you stack them on top of each other for a long period of time with everything else being laid in, I think it can help. So certainly from a glucose management standpoint, we would likely see some, we would see some benefit from utilizing Lantus. The only issue we tend to see from females is more of a compliance thing. Some people don't like to inject themselves. And also because you can run into fluid retention, guys can sort of almost get away with it with a beard. But if you run in as a female, as like water retention in your face, there's a compliance issue there. So those are the only like negatives I would see with it, but it certainly is an option.
Yeah. I think it's, especially with females, there is that barrier of, and trying to tell a female, hey, look, injectable performance-enhancing drugs are going to probably be safer for you than orals. And that statement usually gets met with quite a bit of shock. Like, no, it's in a needle. It's like, okay, well, I'm trying to explain the compounds that we would use in an injectable sense have a lot more research showing, like Primobolan, obviously we're going up to 1,200 milligrams in female trials. Like, it's going to be better than you smashing Anavar year round.
One thing I'd say to that is there also is a massive person-dependent element here. So the thing when people reference that 12 milligram a week, it did have a 50% dropout. So like a lot of people did find a very bad effect from that. And anecdotally, I'll see some female clients like will say, look, Primo might be a better option here. They'll try it and they'll literally notice straight away clitoral enlargement, and this is legit Primo as well. Like they're like, but I never noticed that with Anavar. Well, fuck, drop that out, use the Anavar, because there is obviously going to be a huge person dependent. And this is where I see a lot of coaches, they're like, no, Primo's obviously better. It's like, well, actually you're disregarding that person's experience. And that's a really important thing to just kind of get in here is, as much as we can look at that data and say, yes, theoretically, Primo should be safer for you for all those reasons listed, you're not seeing that in real life. In that case, for you, Anavar is better. For whatever reason that your body metabolizes that drug, it is better for you. And we know they're both legit drugs at this point as well. So, yes, I would agree. But sometimes that's the thing I wanted to just mention is, let's not disregard what's happening in real world.
Obviously, someone's genetic individuality plays a huge part. You've got, if we use, I guess, the correlation between training, you've got some people who can do like 4 sets of bicep curls a week and they fucking grow.
Yeah.
Or, you know what I mean? Like they've got to train legs 3 times a week to get them to grow. Like everyone has that form of individuality, that individual response to the stimulus, whether that's training or PDs. And I think that's definitely like, it's when we are selecting anything PD wise, it's okay. This is the information that we've got. This is what I guess the general consensus shows, but your individual response is a huge factor defining on what we do. Like, obviously, you made the statement before, like you would try and push someone's testosterone as high as they can tolerate, whereas some people start seeing like aromatization and like obviously nipple sensitivity and all that sort of stuff on as little as 200 milligrams. So
I'm that guy.
Yeah. Well, I've had a client like that. Like, I mean, he had signs of gyno when he was natty. So, I mean, it's where he obviously now has that because he wants to take bodybuilding fairly seriously. He's had to obviously book in surgery and get rid of that. So that's an issue. And like, I think some people had see that and they make the automatic assumption like, oh, this guy's used way too much gear.
No, he's got prepubescent gyno and it's fucked him up.
Yeah. And it's also the situation like when you see someone who's got really bad acne, I'm like, okay, just because that someone's got bad acne doesn't mean it's because they've taken huge amounts of gear. Like there's a lot of other factors that come into play that can have their effect on that system in the body. But I think with the PD things, everyone's just so focused on what more can I take? Like what more I guess things that I got in the shopping cart that I can add to the list. And a lot of these people who are trying to, accumulate all these different types of PDs into their structure. It's like, man, you don't even stick to a diet. Like you're out drinking every weekend.
I was about to say this. I was like, people vastly overestimate the drugs. And look, the drugs work. Like we've got loads of studies. The Barson 1996 study is one I like to reference all the time. People that didn't train and took drugs gain more muscle than people that trained and didn't take drugs. So they work. But it's like, okay, how good is your sleep? How good is your stress management? How good is your training? I see so many people whose training is absolute shit. And they're like, oh, drugs aren't working. I need more. I'm like, you need to fucking sort your training out. I need nutrition. People eat like absolute shit. They can't stick to a meal plan. Also can't stick to any sort of structure. Start there and then bring that up because it's not the drugs you need. It's more routine and more discipline on that side of things.
Even, I guess, playing devil's advocate, I see some people that do jump on PDs and like, oh, it's PDs, give me the sides. I'm like, man, you eat like shit. You don't sleep enough. And your knee-jerk reaction is to blame the PD aspect of things when they could be using quite minimal in terms of dosage. And it's tidy up your diet. And I think it's a lot of people think they have this preconceived notion. It's like, oh, because I'm taking gear, I can eat.
I can eat whatever I want.
Yeah, because it's obviously going to have this sort of like net effect of like, oh, if I take gear, the size that I'm going to gain is going to be solid. So, it's the dirty bulk and
your dreamer bulk.
Yeah, and people watching videos of Arnie back in the day eating his like chicken breast with like a liter of tomato sauce and like almost taking what these people are doing. I mean, Sam Sulek's a good example. It's like he eats like shit. You know what I mean? Like a whole box of like what's it called? The cinnamon toast crunch is not a viable food option when you're not eating anything else in terms of like dietary structure. Like there's no fiber, no fruits, no vegetables.
The thing is, when you start getting blood work and you start to do that sort of stuff regularly, you will see the problems manifest itself. I can always tell from someone's blood work if they've eaten shit. And like realistically, if you're going to go down the PD route, unless you want to run into severe health problems, you better be on top of your diet, your cardio, your sleep, stress management, because they will come back and get you every single time. And people, like I literally hammer clients like, like for example, I was on a podcast yesterday and I was speaking to someone about PEDs, and avocados as an example is an amazing fat source, one that every client should, and people are like, I don't like avocados, can I just have some peanut butter instead? I'm like, shut the fuck up. Like it's like, are you worried about your health? Like you're literally pinning 2 grams of gear a week and you're like, oh, I want to eat junk food every day. You're like, well, that's a real quick way to fuck your lipids up. And again, I'm not, like I said at the start, it's never the case of chastising these people and making them seem like idiots, but at the same time, it's like, okay, look at the ramifications of what what's going to happen here, and that is that's the concern. I'm not saying like let's eat avocados every meal, but as an example, is these are things we do need to consider. Is like there's no such thing as a free lunch. Yeah, these things get you bigger, but they also affect a lot of the other body systems. Unless you're willing to do the work on the other end and like sort your diet out, sort your training out, sort your nutrition out, sort your stress management, sleep out. Yeah, you're going to be vastly disappointed when you don't get the gains you want, but you're also going to run into a bunch of health impacts as well.
Well, so if you go to the doctor and you've got any form of like fairly serious medical condition, they're going to be quite direct with you. It's not them being a cunt; it's them not wanting you to die.
This is
so. I think one area that I don't see talked about anywhere near enough is the link between mental health and PD use.
Yeah.
Both the impact that PD use has on mental health and the risk factor of people with pre-existing mental health conditions taking quite a lot of stuff and not factoring in that as like, I mean, I've come across people who, I mean, they get their bloods done, they do all that sort of stuff, blood pressure, but I'm like, dude, you have like PTSD or a fairly serious medical condition. And I'm not saying this is, I mean, a death sentence for your PD use, but that's something that's got to be under control.
Yeah.
Before you even think about PEDs, not just from a perspective of like, we don't want to make your symptoms any worse, but we want to make sure that your approach to this is not healthy, but healthy as we can possibly do it.
Yeah.
And I've had people come in for a consult and they're like on the edge of their seat the whole time, like bouncing up and down. They're like, man, I'll just do whatever it takes to get jacked. I'm like, whoa. Like,
will you look after yourself?
Yeah. But, and I think is that something that like with your clients, is that sort of a factor that you take into consideration from the initial consult phase, and obviously as you work through with the client, is that something that you monitor as you're going? Or
so with the neurological side of things, obviously when we say mental health, obviously it's quite a broad brush term.
Yeah,
what I tend to focus on is when we look at anabolics, look, any superphysiological dose is going to have some level of neurological impact. Okay, we know that's going to be a factor. Now there's proposed mechanisms why that occurs: oxidative stress. Whether it's increased glutamate production, which we know can lead to problems. And certainly there's some people with ADHD that have got very high levels of glutamate. We see that present itself in things like Alzheimer's, dementia, where excessively high glutamate. We know that there's also drugs which are particularly neurotoxic, equipoise, dianabol, tren, nandrolone, synthetic progestins in general are very neurotoxic, which is why I avoid them. So anytime we're going super physiological, what we have to do is try and mitigate those issues. Yeah. And that would be not using drugs like equipoise, nandrolone, tren, or dianabol, specifically neurotoxic drugs that we want to avoid. That would be kind of the first port of call. And then also go, right, let's manage our oxidative stress, which we should always be doing as a matter of course as a PD taking individual. And then you may want to think about, depending on, I'm assuming you're not ADHD or anything in this case, because that would obviously depend if you're low glutamate or high glutamate and how you're going to respond to these things. But say you were someone who was taking PDs, we start to look at what supplementation can we take from a neurological standpoint to balance your glutamate GABA. And that's obviously, that's a very much a work in progress. There's no one size fits all process there. So these are things that we would always want to consider. And certainly something I've put a lot more time into of recent years, because I'm worried I don't want to age badly. These are important factors. So for myself, I'm looking at the neurochemistry side of things in a lot more depth, which if we think about the we've got 6 toxicities, shall we say, from anabolic steroid use. We've got liver, kidney, heart, vascular system, blood, and then the last one's brain. People think about all the first 5, fair amount. Like obviously people consider the heart, the liver, the kidneys, maybe thinking about their blood, maybe thinking about their vascular system. No one's thinking about the brain. And that's one of those things I know for a fact that it's going to play out very, very badly in the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, of seeing people go into early onset dementia, Alzheimer's, neurodegeneration. We're already seeing it more and more so. And with the TikTok generation, they're pushing very high dosages, no health side of things, pushing trend, pushing all these drugs to a very high degree. We are going to see the negative outcome of that play out very badly.
And obviously coinciding with that, this new sort of generation with the heavy PED use dose, high amount of stim use, very minimal sleep, recreational drugs. Obviously, there's no, I guess, cardio, obviously, to aid cardiovascular system. And I mean, I've got like a Dr. Zeus book of fucking mental health disorders. So like, that's something that I've had to. I mean, like ADHD, bipolar, ASD, PTSD. So that did play a part in me making the decision to like stop doing like actual cycles with the goal of like exogenous doses to try and put on as much muscle as possible, because I'm like, okay, it's not really worth it. Like I don't have any intention of competing. TRT is enough, obviously, to improve just general quality of life. But I think a lot of people, heavy PD users, there's a huge culture over here, especially in WA, with people working like fly in, fly out. And you know what I mean? When they're at work, the 2 weeks at work, food's all solid, fucking gear uses through the roof. They're in the gym every night. And then, you know what I mean? They fly in from site. They go see the dealer, pick up a bag, 3 or 4 days on the bag, no sleep. Then they go into almost, recovery mode for a couple of days. Then it's back to site again. And shit, man, like I've lost track of the amount of people I've seen have like massive mental breakdowns.
Oh, you can't not. When you start mixing things like cocaine and drugs like nandrolone, we know that causes like depression in rodents, which sounds crazy to say, but there's a lot of things where like, you shouldn't really be messing with these drugs. And I personally don't think, and listen, I've done this loads in my past. Like, I'm not going to pretend I wasn't an Ibiza fiend and mixing recreational drugs with anabolic steroids, but at the end of the day, as I've got older, you realize that there's less tolerance for this. And certainly if you are someone that does struggle with mental health, adding in recreational drugs to anabolic steroid use to, and again, as guys, no one's doing anything to actually manage their mental health either. How are you managing these things? I don't just mean from a drug perspective or a supplementation perspective. I mean, are you taking any active work to maybe see a therapist or work through these problems or whatever it may be? Which a lot of people will be listening to this and be like, no, I don't need to do that, bro. It's like, if you're saying that, you probably do. And I think people are always willing to like work. Oh, I'll get a PT for my physique, but like, what are you doing for your brain? So there's a whole host of things that we need to look at when it comes to mental health. And I see it all the time. People who I meet and they realize like I'm in the game. I take very low drugs, but take drugs. They're like, oh, you're really calm. And I was like, yes. Because drugs don't make you an arsehole, but they might exacerbate what you already do. And and I think also a lot of people use it as an excuse, but if you haven't got these things in place from a stack design, prophylactic standpoint, supplementation, mental health, I guess, mental health work, it can exacerbate a lot of pre-existing issues.
Yeah, and I think it's, if you've got, I guess, something like ADHD, and I mean, I'm the king of hyperfixation. Like, I've had that many random hobbies over the years, completely fucking obscure, none that make any sense. And it's an hyper addictive personality. And that's one of the reasons why, like, I gave up all recreational drugs completely, all of them, because I don't have an off switch.
Yeah.
It's not like, okay, like 1 or 2 pills for a festival. It's like, okay, how many can I take before I black out?
Yeah.
And
I've got mates like you.
So, and it's obviously, it comes down to the bipolar. It's obviously, it's a seeking of the
dopamine,
instigation of the drug kicking in. It's like, okay, well, now it's kicked in, like,
now I'll go on that again.
So we're going to get, and that was obviously one of the bigger reasons for me, because you're pushing the envelope very, very far. But I see a lot of people who come from hyper addictive personalities who then move into, I guess, taking anabolic steroids and even just the gym in general. And it develops this addiction, and it just compounds on the already existing manic behavior. And it's funny, man. I've met guys who take steroids but also smoke meth.
Right.
And I'm like, you couldn't do 2 more things counterintuitive to each other ever.
I always laugh when I see people outside the gym having a cigarette, and that just takes it to another level. Like, I was gonna smoke this crack. Yeah. Fucking hell.
But I think it's just that thing. Like, some people, the steroid use, even I've seen people who are previous drug addicts, you know what I mean, meth, cocaine, like whatever the case is, and steroids just become the next step.
It's a drug that it's not necessarily addictive, but the outcomes are. So there's no addictive component of anabolic steroid use, but the physiological changes that you see and the way it makes you feel, etc., obviously have a level of addiction that come with that.
Oh, of course, and it would almost, in a way, compare to like fame, like being a celebrity.
I
mean, and it feeds into that. And I guess if someone's entire identity is built around being big, being jacked, being the chick in the gym that's got fucking massive glutes and has all the Instagram following, whatever the case is, it's a lot of those people will disregard their health in an attempt to latch onto that and hold on to that. And this is a scary part, because everyone is looking at a polarized version on Instagram. And, you know what I mean? You've got influencers or hobby bodybuilders that don't actually compete, but obviously look like they do. And they're dropping it like 25, 26.
Yeah. Again, these people have probably never looked at their health markers. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And this is where it goes back to.
Well, it's like that Joe Aesthetics guy that died in Thailand earlier in the year.
Yeah, I mean, again, I always have a little bit of a, not an issue talking about this sort of stuff, but it almost feels a little bit, it looked like an aortic dissection. So it looked like heavy stim use, heavy anabolic use, may have been an underlying issue. It's hard to say. Now, that stuff that could have probably been prevented, I hate to say. Managing blood pressure effectively, not pushing dosages too high, being careful with stim use. Again, we've normalized a lot of behaviors that unfortunately are going to come back to bite us. So, like, and I'm as guilty as anyone else. Like, you're talking, I used to take probably 1.5 grams of caffeine per day just to feel normal, and it's like, that ain't good. Like, you do that for an extended period of time, stim, a lot of drugs that are affecting your endothelial function in terms of like the ability for the blood vessel to essentially flex. When you're doing that, you've got a stiffer blood vessel, you've got high blood pressure, you're dealing with stims all the time. Imagine just slamming water, imagine having a garden hose and trying to put a fire hydrant through that. At some point over time, that's going to bust. And that's what we're doing with the body systems there, unfortunately. And it's like, could that have been avoided? Probably, yeah. And that's the really, really sad part is, and the thing is, with that Joe guy, he seemed like a genuinely fucking lovely dude. And it's like, it is avoidable. And it wasn't because he was, it wasn't because he was a cunt. It was because unfortunately, he's run into a health problem that probably could have been avoided.
Do you think there would be a part to play in that, of obviously the pressures that social media?
Oh, no doubt. Like, I mean,
of like, okay, like, and I'm purely speculating. I'm not going to say that, like, I'm not going to make assumptions, but like, I mean, he may or may not have been aware of the health conditions, and he may or may not have ignored them too. You know what I mean? He's known as the dude who's super shredded all year round.
Yeah. I mean, it's got to be hard. Like, the reason I don't, again, I've got a fucking minuscule following compared to what he had. But the reason I don't put my physique much on social media isn't because I'm not in shape. It's because When you start to use that as your marketing tool, where do you go from there? And I think you can easily run into this world where, firstly, it's a constant state of comparison. So you can't be in a good place from a mental health perspective, because at what point does it stop? Like, okay, I'm not as say you had a good year financially. Well, I'm not Jeff Bezos. I'm not Elon Musk. I'm a piece of shit. So there's that. So it's like, do I just work harder and harder? And in this case, when you're comparing yourself and you've got to look a certain way for your marketing, you'll do anything to take there, because it impacts your perception of self, because obviously it's fame at the end of the day. It's also going to impact the drugs that you take and the things that you're willing to do to stay there. It impacts your finances. So it's everything. And again, I don't know the situation, but speaking just generically, is it going to be a detriment that your entire brand is based upon how lean and big you are? There's probably a negative outcome to that. And unfortunately, now I saw something the other day. It was looking at when Hugh Jackman got the role of Wolverine, how many years ago it was. By today's standards, he was out of shape. And you like, but at that point in time, he was in really good shape. And it's like these standards have changed massively. And it's actually, as much as people talk about female beauty standards, which I think are obviously unfair and realistic for women, it's also becoming the same for men. So you're getting these guys taking more and more drugs to look a certain way. And I'm no different. Like, do I take antibiotics purely because of quality of life? No, because I like the way it makes me look. But I'm sensible enough to know that I can't push the envelope with these things, and I'm not willing to. But it's if you're in that rat race and you're in that social media bubble, it's much harder. Like, I can remove myself from that because my self-worth isn't purely dictated on how I look.
Yeah,
but there's an element of that.
It's that saying. It's, I guess, the comparison is a thief of joy.
Yeah,
and it's like you say, to be completely your worth as a person to be dictated purely from the way you look. It wouldn't be a nice place to be.
No, you're gonna live a very sad life.
Yeah, and I think social media has created a generation of extremes. Extreme caffeine use, extreme PD use, extreme forms of dieting, just general extremes. And it's sad because, I mean, I've got 3 girls, and the last thing I would want is my daughters to look at social media and go, oh, that's normal. You know what I mean? Like the girl who's got completely shredded abs or all year round is normal, and I'm going to aspire to that, and I'm going to try and hold my standard to that.
Well, to a weird level, with analogy here, but it's like porn, right? So porn's so bad for your brain because you're looking at something that's you're getting a dopamine kick for like no work, and you're setting these unrealistic standards of what sex is meant to be, and people are getting really confused by that. It's exactly what you're doing to some degree by just like looking at these things on Instagram. It's like these aren't real. You talk about the top 0.001%, but by doing that, you've got these. You're throwing into the mix. Now I've got to take this drug and this and this because of this perception that I have to be this way.
Yeah.
I mean, look at it like this. Going completely off piece to a little bit, but there's a thing with finances. I think it's in the UK. Only 4% of the country earn over 100 grand a year. But Instagram would have you believe that everyone's a millionaire. And I speak to some of my friends, and they're like, "Oh, I'm not doing very well because I'm on 80 grand." I'm like, I don't think you're not doing very well. I think you're doing very well, but unfortunately, you end up having this perception like within that, and it's exactly the same. It's even worse with physique stuff because you're like, "Oh, if I take this drug, I'll change it," and it becomes a bit risky on that front.
Oh, it is, and it's like, okay, like I need this body or this car or this purchase or this amount of money in my account to, I guess, be
happy,
worthy, or But it's a sad reality, man. But we'll probably wrap it up there, man. We've been going for nearly an hour and a half. I don't want to keep you too long.
That's right, man.
If people want to find you on socials, find your services, obviously the Physique Collective content, where is the best place for them to do this?
So you can find me at Matt_Physique Collective. I offer one-to-one online coaching, primarily for coaches, but obviously people that are looking for, I guess, look after their health and get the best outcomes. We're having someone else take the load off. I also offer coach and business mentoring. So it's something I offer where I help coaches to get better coaches and to grow their business. So if anyone's looking to grow their business in 2025, drop me a message. And I also have a coaching course, which is coming out in January. To basically, it's an 8-week course teaching people how to become better coaches. The last one sold out in an hour. So hopefully the next one will do the same. So if you want to become a better coach, that's launching there. And you can also find me at physiquecollective.com. We've got an app, which is $9.99 a month. It's full of information. We've got 300 hours of video on there covering every single topic. We've got a very active forum, which Joe and I are on every single day answering questions. So if you want to get an answer to a question, maybe you can't afford coaching, maybe you just want to get an answer to some questions, find out how these drugs work, and really dive into a bit more the health side of things. $9.99 a month, probably the best investment you're ever going to make in terms of your knowledge on this side of things. And that's me, man. I'd like to say thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Talking shop, drugs, and all sorts. And
awesome, man. I appreciate you coming on, making the time to come on. Obviously, it's a bit of a time difference, but
that's right, man. Pleasure. Absolutely pleasure.
Good to talk shop, man. I'll talk to you soon.